Hello, my name is Jeremy Barnes, and today I'm going to do a review for the Miss Marvel series on Disney Plus. This is one of Marvel's newer characters, but she's a really great one, and I know that she's a fan favorite from people that read the comics. And I actually did read the initial comic book run of Miss Marvel, and I fell in love with that character as well. She reminded me a lot of my favorite superhero, which is Spider-Man, but she's on the female side of that and is definitely like way different from Spider-Man. Just they have a similar energy, and that's kind of what I like about both of them. But I'll go into that a little bit more in this review. Um, I'm gonna talk about like different aspects of the show, spoiler free, and then at the end I'm gonna talk about a few spoilers, not too much. But overall, this show is really solid. It was good beginning to end. There was no like real like dip in quality or my enjoyment of the show. Of course, I like some episodes more than others. And I actually just rewatched the whole show from beginning to end, straight through. And I actually liked it more the second time. And I think that's always a good thing when something you watch is actually better the second time, or like the more you watch it, the more you like it. Um, it's it's not so good if it's the other way around, where you like it a lot the first time, and then it's worse each time you watch it. So I think that's a really good thing about this show. Um, so the first thing I'm going to talk about are the characters. Of course, starting with Kamala Khan, the lead. She's who becomes Miss Marvel in the show, and she's a young fan of the Avengers, specifically Captain Marvel. So obviously, as a fan of Marvel, as you see Eternals and Guardians of the Galaxy right here, I can relate to that, and that's kind of the whole point of Miss Marvel as a character. And to show that, I'm wearing my shirt that says "More Than a Fan" from Marvel Studios. It's my Infinity Saga shirt. They have all the titles of most of the movies. I don't think they had the last few on there because it was made before Far From Home came out. I'll show you that though briefly too. And Kamala becomes more than a fan in this show by getting her own powers and becoming a superhero in her own right. So that was really cool to see. But Kamala's character, yeah, like she has a very vibrant energy to her that is infectious. Her smile, like she's always smiling. She has a big imagination, and she's just a really fun character. And she was portrayed, in my opinion, perfectly by Iman Vellani, who is actually a new actress. Like she hasn't really done much acting, and she said she didn't even want to be an actor really. But she had to audition for this role, and she ended up getting it. So that was awesome for her. Her journey kind of mirrors Kamala's journey in a lot of ways because Aman is also a fan of the MCU. So that's why she was kind of perfect for the role and ended up getting it. The next character I'm going to talk about is Bruno, who is her best friend. And unbeknownst to her, he has a huge crush on her. And they kind of bond more on the geek culture of things. Um, he is very kind of like science whizzy. He like makes stuff for Kamala, like technology. He's really skilled in STEM, um, but she doesn't realize. I don't think, or she doesn't want to realize that he has a crush on her, and kind of just wants to keep it like as friends. I'm not sure how long they've known each other, but it seems like they've known each other for at least a bit of time. Um, and yeah, I don't know if that ever is revealed at all in the show or in the movie. I mean, in the comic book. Um, but either way, they're like pretty close friends. And then on the other side of that is Nakia, who I would say is also one of her best friends, and she's more related to Kamala, or like they relate to each other on the Muslim culture side of things. So whereas Bruno is like with the geek culture that Kamala's into, Nakia comes from the same Muslim culture that Kamala does. So that's how they know each other and get along so well. But they're all a little bit of a friend group together. Um, and Nakia is also great. She's a really cool character, I think. Um, she wears a hijab, which I know is something that not all people within that culture or other cultures that wear hijabs necessarily always do. So I think it's a choice, especially specifically because Kamala and Nakia are both Muslims in Canada, or actually not Canada, in the U.S., New Jersey. Um, that's also like a different thing from like actually in the countries that they're from. It might be different there. But I don't know too much about that culture, so I'm not going to speak anymore on that. But the next characters that I'm going to mention are a group, and it's Kamala's family. So starting with her parents, her mother and her father, they both have a very like protective, obviously as most parents are, like personality when it comes to their interactions with Kamala, but they show it in different ways. Like Kamala's dad seems a little bit more supportive of her and like kind of like a cheerleader for her, whereas her mom kind of just wants to shelter her and just keep her out of the world and like from harm's way, I guess. And kind of just wants her to do what she expects her to do, which is, I guess, kind of be like the perfect daughter. But because of that, I have a soft spot more for Kamala's father, and he's a really big sweetheart. He has a lot of heart, and I think he's a big softie. So I really like that about him. Um, but we do see some development in the show with her mom and her attitude towards Kamala. That was really cool to see, and I think very real for a Muslim Pakistani American family, or what I would assume might be the case with that group. And then Kamala's brother, she also has a brother, an older brother, and he was also great. He has a lot of humor to him as well, kind of a dry sense of humor, whereas Kamala's kind of more like quippy. But he's funny and he's great too. And kind of like subplot of the show is that he's getting married to his girlfriend, and the family's kind of just preparing for that in the early episodes of the season, or like the first half, since it's only 6 episodes. And that was really cool to see as well, which kind of showed more of the Pakistani Muslim culture. So that was great as well. And then the other family member that I want to mention from Kamala's family is her grandmother, who isn't as big of a character, but she is, I think, very important to more of the plot elements of the show and kind of like the superhero side of it. But she was kind of like thought of as like, I don't know, kind of crazy within her culture, like in her family and in her town, because she like spoke of things that were like mystical that people didn't believe in. So they kind of like shunned her in a way, including her own daughter, which is Kamala's mother. Um, and that's kind of one of the reasons why like they were separated, because Kamala's grandmother, who she calls Nani, is um is still in Pakistan, I think. Um, Whereas Kamala and her family, like her immediate family, moved to the U.S. Um, and that's kind of the reason why her mom left Kamala's grandmother. And I'll talk more about that in the spoiler section, because it does get into some specific stuff that is good to reveal or like find out in the show. So the next character I'm going to talk about is Kamran, and he's kind of like the new kid to the school. He's a boy that Kamala develops a crush on, like as soon as she sees him, one of those like love at first sight sort of deals. Um, and it seems like he's like actually into her like right away as well, which I wasn't expecting, because I'm pretty sure he was a character in the initial comic run, but I didn't get the sense that he was into her like how she was into him. But in the show, like it's a kind of like an immediate click between them. Um, and I don't know if that happens later in the comics, but it was a cool thing to see. And Miss Marvel is kind of like almost the flip side of Spider-Man in that sense, because In the comics, both of them. I mean, I don't know much about Miss Marvel's comics besides what I read, but I guess based off of this show, what I would imagine these characters were adapted from the comics. Kamala has a lot of boys that are into her, so she has a lot of love interests or like possibilities, and that's something that Spider-Man has to deal with too. But a lot of times you see him not get the girl. But here everybody wants Kamala, and so that was kind of a funny flip on those two characters. Like how I said that they're kind of very similar, but in that way they're also kind of different. Um, and then the next group of characters, I don't want to mention each of them individually because they don't really work that way. They function as a unit. Are the Clandestine, and they're kind of like the early villains of the series. Um, and they come from within Kamala's culture as what they know as the Djinn. But we find out here it's a I think unique take that is not based off their original like real life version of the culture. Um, is they come from an alternate dimension within the Marvel universe, and it's called the Noor dimension, which means light. And that's where we find out Kamala's powers come from, and the way that is shown or the way that it's portrayed. I'll talk more about in the spoiler section. Um, but that's kind of why her powers were changed to be kind of like a light base, where she could kind of summon physical, like hard light is what they call it in the show. So she could use it as like platforms or to like stretch or create things just from her mind, pretty much. Which is different from the comics where she had like stretchy powers, where she could kind of like shapeshift and kind of like grow her body and just different parts of her body. A lot of times we see her fists specifically. Um, so she has a lot of those same kind of attributes here, but it's demonstrated in a different way. So that's kind of where it comes from. And then I wanted to mention this character separately from the rest of Kamala's family, but there's also her great grandmother who also shows up kind of later in the show that we see, and she's kind of goes to the roots of Kamala's powers. And it's her grandmother, her great grandmother Aisha, and she gets an entire episode like dedicated to her, and that episode was a standout for sure. And the actress in that one was also really good. So that's all I'm gonna say about that for now. And then there's one more antagonist in the show, and it's the Department of Damage Control, Agent Weaver. And alongside her, we also see the return of a damage control agent that was featured in Spider-Man No Way Home, the one that was after Peter Parker. Um, but here, he's not really as much the antagonist, but they are obviously both involved in the same thing, and they kind of want to track Kamala down because of her powers and potential danger that she may pose. Because I'm assuming, like, they haven't really talked about it in the MCU, but I'm assuming the Sokovia Accords are still a thing. So anybody with powers kind of has to like deal with the government, and in this case, damage control. If they're not registered with the government, and Kamala's not at the point that she gets powers in the show. So that's kind of another antagonist that they have to deal with. Um, and then now I'm going to talk about the story of the show. And it's a coming of age story for a young Muslim Pakistani New Jersey resident who comes into her own power after looking up to others like the Avengers her entire life because she grew up through all of these events in the MCU. And along the way, she also learns more about her family heritage, which I briefly touched on already. And it was a great story. It was great to see that family heritage and culture, and then also to see the New Jersey side of things, um, being her like birthplace and her home. That has its own culture within it, and both cultures were shown in the show. So that was really fun to see, and obviously all the Marvel stuff because she is a fan of the Avengers. That was fun as well. So now I'm gonna just talk about the humor briefly. The show has a lot of comedy, and it's really good comedy. She's really funny, and a lot of the characters are really funny in the show. Um, so that was a real standout in terms of like tone for the show, for sure. Um, and I was actually kind of surprised by that because from the trailers, like the trailers weren't really capturing my attention that much. So I didn't have high expectations for the show at all. But I was pleasantly surprised by the quality, and it was really good. And like I said, even better the second time. So I really loved all of that stuff. And being a Marvel show, does also have some action. I wouldn't say the action is as much the focus as some of the other stuff. But going along with the action are the special effects in the show because that's kind of more of a prevalent thing with Kamala's powers being light based. It's all like CG powers, obviously. Um, but what I want to mention specifically with the action is that there was like a couple of good different types of actions in the show in different episodes. In episode 3, there was a really good fight scene where Kamala faced off against the Clandestine, and that was really good. It was choreographed really well, and we got the sense because it was kind of Kamala's like first real fight. Like she was like kind of just going with the flow and didn't really know what to do, so it was kind of more based off of instinct and like reflexes, whereas everybody she was fighting against were highly trained. Um, but that was definitely a standout for sure. In episode 4, there was a cool chase scene on the streets of Karachi. She actually goes back to like her family's hometown in Pakistan, and there's a chase scene again with the clandestine chasing her and her allies down, and that was a really cool scene. It kind of reminded me a bit of the like train sequence in Avengers: Age of Ultron, but obviously it was different because it was a different setting. And then there's kind of a set piece in the finale episode, episode 6, in her high school. That's kind of like where the final showdown goes down. And that was like really cool and a really fun sequence because we see Kamala and all of her friends kind of ally with her to help her like stop the threat in that episode. And they use everything like the home field advantage, knowing their high school and like a bunch of like science and sports stuff to combat their adversaries. And it was really cool the way that it was shot and just done. It was, I think, in my opinion, very well put together. So that was also a standout with the action. As for the special effects, I would say that the effects of Kamala's powers are a little cheesy the way that they look to me, but they're not like completely terrible. It's just the design of them don't work for me. It doesn't look like believable to me or like realistic, even in a comic book world where a lot of the stuff is not like something that you would actually believe could be real. But I feel like everything I've seen in the MCU like has been something that I could see existing somewhere out there, like maybe not in our world, but in some world out there. Just the way it looks, like it looks realistic, but Kamala's powers don't look realistic to me. Like it just looks kind of more like animation to me, so it was less believable. And it's probably because the show has a low budget, it being a show and not a movie. So I think those powers were kind of indicative of that lower budget. So hopefully, when she goes into the movies, it'll look even better. But we'll see. I'm not sure, obviously, what they're gonna do with that. But it was not my favorite visual effects for sure. So now I want to talk about the cinematography of the show and just like along with that, it's just like how it was shot and kind of the style of it, which the show is super stylish. I would say especially the first 2 episodes and maybe even like the first one, even the most. Um, there's a lot of kind of like with text, like there's a lot of texting parts in there, and they use like lights in the first, I think in the first episode, maybe in the first and second episode, where like there are like lights in Circle Q, which was is one of the key locations that Kamala goes to. It's like a little corner store that Bruno lives above. Um, where the lights of the store, like open or closed signs instead of that are like what they're texting to each other. And then we see stuff kind of like that later in the show, like when she's on her way to Karachi, we see the text through the plane mirror window and other stuff like that. And this show is very colorful as well because Kamala's powers are are color based, light based. And then also her culture is very colorful as well, like the clothing and makeup and all of that. Um, so, and even the culture in Jersey City, like all the street art, is also very colorful. So that was something that also really stood out and I liked about the show. Um, and then some other cool things with that are Avenger Con in the first episode, where we kind of got to see Kamala's like just enjoyment of the show floor, and she kind of goes in La La Land where she kind of imagines herself even in even greater circumstances than she already is in, where like kind of she's the focus. And there was one aspect in that in Avengers one, I mean in the episode one with the Avenger Con, which is basically just a convention for the Avengers where they have some real life artifacts from some other battles, and there's just a bunch of merch that people are selling. So that was really cool to see and really fun as well. And Kamala participates in a Captain Marvel like costume contest in Avenger Con, so that was also fun to see because she is a Captain Marvel fan. So she's like super into the culture, even more so than I am in that sense because I do wear costumes, but only for like Halloween. I don't ever go to conventions and like do like cosplay. Whereas Kamala does, and she also animates like videos too that are dedicated to the Avengers on the YouTube channel that she has in universe. So that was all really fun to see as well. That's actually how episode one opens up. And then in episode two, when she first like kind of meets Kamran, she's like has her googly eyes, and there's like this sequence where she kind of does a whole love dance after like they first meet, and she's kind of like gets the sense that like he's actually into her too, so she's super happy. And that sequence was really fun as well. There's a song that is played there, and like her parents are just like, "Yo, what's going on?" Because she's just in her own little la la land there. So that was great as well. And then some other stuff like less to do with the cinematography and more just kind of like big moments in the show that were just beautiful to watch, like just visually cool. Are in episode three we see her brother's wedding. I was trying to think of his name earlier, but it's Aamir. That's her brother's name. Um, so we see his wedding with his wife and Pakistani. I don't know specifically Muslim, but Pakistani weddings are like very big, and they do like a bunch of dances, and there's like a huge dance that happens there, and that was definitely one of the standouts of the entire show, and especially in episode three. Um, and that happens shortly before that action sequence that happens in that episode as well, when she fights the clandestine. So that episode was a standout for both the action and um, just the like culture that is shown in the show, or showcased in the show. And then the last part is the episode six planning sequence. So that kind of goes back to the action thing as well. Like before the action goes down, they're Kamala and her friends are all planning like what they're gonna do, and there's a lot of artwork that she like kind of does, and we also see that in episode one when they're planning to go to AvengerCon, that Kamala like sketches her own little drawings. So that same style is shown in the first and the last episode of the show, and like I said, the visuals of that are really fun to watch and really cool. So I like that as well. And then pretty much the like last thing that I want to mention is the cultural aspect of the show, which I have touched on before. Um, Specifically, though, I want to talk about Kamala's Pakistani Muslim culture, and all of that was really great to see. It's always great to see other cultures different from my own in movies and TV shows, and just like learn about people in that way. And that's one of the things that I like about film, that we could see it in a way where like we probably wouldn't otherwise. People that are not from that culture or know people that are from that culture. So that was really cool that it was showcased in the show. And there's like music that plays. Specifically, I think the standouts for me are in the credits of all the episodes. There's traditional music that is played, um, and that was all really fun and cool to hear and really enjoyable. Obviously, the clothing, and I mentioned before the artwork that we see not only in Jersey but also when she goes to Karachi, her family's hometown. Um, and then along with that are the settings. So Karachi, we also see Kamala's religious or like spiritual side in the mosque in Jersey City, and and all that stuff was cool too. We learned some of the customs or traditions within the Muslim culture. And like there's like kind of a different seating area for the women and the men in the mosque. I don't know what the services are called in Muslim culture, but from what I know in like Christian culture, it would be called a mass. And like there's different traditions that other people are better suited to talk about. And actually, I'll link a video that I watched that kind of goes into all of the not only Muslim Pakistani culture in the show, but also the Jersey City culture. So that was a really cool video to watch to like really catch all the nuances that are demonstrated in the show. So I highly recommend to check that out if you like the show, or even if you just want to know more about these different cultures or even mixing cultures, because a lot of this is super specific. Like Kamala is a Muslim Pakistani um, superhero fan in New Jersey, so all that is encompassed and like shown super specific as somebody like that in the show. And this video, I think that person who made it kind of identifies with all of those things. So that's why it's really cool, and he kind of nailed it on the head with that. Um, so the last thing that I'll do is just kind of give you my episode ranking of the series. I don't think it's as important as like some of the other ones because, like I said, the quality was very high throughout the show. But I don't think it really changed really from my first to my second viewing of the show. But I'm not 100% positive sure about this. But I think my favorite episode is still episode 3, which is titled Destin, and that's the one that has the big action sequence and the wedding sequence that were the standouts. And then episode 5 is called Time and Again, and that episode was really cool because it showed that was the episode that showcased Kamala's great grandmother, and her story just as its own episode, as its own thing, was just a really like great story. So it was a real standout episode for me. And they also show Kamala's story like evolve in that episode as well. So that's another reason why it was really good. And honestly, I would have watched the whole movie just about Kamala's great grandmother. That's how good that story was. But because it was not related to Kamala's own story as much, that's why it's not my like number one favorite. But honestly, if it was a movie, I think that movie would be cooler than this show as a show overall, because it's kind of more rooted in real history. And I'll talk more about that when I get into the spoilers. But yeah, that was really good. And then I actually really liked the finale of this show as well. Uh, the finales of these Disney Plus shows are usually kind of like lower on my list of like favorite episodes from least or from most to least favorite. But this one is like right in the middle, the top of the list. Halfway through, number 3 on my list is episode 6, and that one is called No Normal. And it's because I just love the whole energy of it, like the whole planning and execution of the way that they are gonna deal with their antagonist was really good. Like I said, done well. And we kind of see Kamala obviously come into her own in that episode and like really reach her initial potential as Miss Marvel. Obviously, she's gonna probably grow a lot throughout her time in the MCU, but this is when she like really became Miss Marvel. It's also like how they've done in a lot of the shows, like is when she kind of gets her actual comic book costume. So that was really cool as well, and the design of the costume was great. I think they nailed it. It looks like how it looks in the comics, but also like realistic to the world of the MCU and not the same as all the other heroes' costumes, which is something that a lot of people kind of argue against. Like they say that all the costumes look the same in the MCU. I don't agree with that argument necessarily. I do see some similarities between certain characters' costumes, but I think it makes sense in story because they're made a lot of times by the same people in universe. But this is not the case with Miss Marvel, and her costume does not have similarities to other characters in my opinion. So I think that was done really well. Um, my fourth favorite episode is episode one, Generation Y, and I thought that was a really good premiere episode as well. So they started and ended the series on high notes, in my opinion. Um, and that gave just a good introduction to everything, Kamala's life, family, her fandom, and everything, her culture. So that was really good. And then my next favorite is probably episode four, and I would say this one is above my least favorite episode because it kind of goes more into like the mythology of the show, and it was really cool learning more about that stuff. Whereas episode two, my least favorite episode, is kind of more of like a bridge kind of episode. Um, like I can't even think of what specifically happens in episode two, but episode four is called Seeing Red. She kind of learns about this other group for the first time in the show, but it's kind of important to her roots and everything that's going on in her life. So that's why she kind of learns more. There's like revelations made in that episode. Episode two is called Crushed, and I think in that episode, it's after like she first gets her powers at the end of the first episode. They're kind of like trying to figure out the kinks of like what her powers actually are. So it was kind of fun for that sense. Oh, and I guess the episode two, the main thing was the introduction of Kamran. Um, but it wasn't as like I don't think important or just entertaining to me as some of the other episodes. So that's why that's my list. And that's pretty much all I have to say for the non-spoiler section of my review. So now I'll give you my rating out of 10. And initially I was gonna give this somewhere between 7 and 8 out of 10 because even though I like this show from beginning to end, I didn't like it as much as like some of the highs of some of the other shows. But because of how like solid it is and how consistent the quality is, I actually on my second viewing would put my rating at an 8, because I definitely think it does not deserve anything lower than a B grade. It would just be a bit of a lower 8 than some of the stuff that I liked more on certain parts, like Falcon and the Winter Soldier was right next on my list of all the Marvel Cinematic Universe projects in my ranking. Um, and that's because the highs of that show I think were higher than anything that I really liked about Miss Marvel. Even though Falcon and the Winter Soldier had some lower points as well, the higher points just outweigh the lower points for me, so that's why. And then now I want to talk about the spoilers section. So the main thing I want to talk about is that Kamala is revealed as the MCU's main 616 timeline's first confirmed mutant. and that's revealed at the end of the show through dialogue from Bruno, because he has some like weird like technology that he has access to or that he created. So he was kind of doing research on her, like I said in episode 2, trying to figure out what her powers were. But he matched her DNA with her family's DNA, and there was like a difference. So her family, we find out in the show, are Djinn. So she's actually descendant of the Djinn, like the Clandestines. And we find out Kamran is also the Djinn, because um, what's her name? I think her name was Najma, is Kamran's mom. She's like kind of like the main adversary that we see. Um, she was back in the same time as Kamala's great grandmother. And we find out that she actually killed Kamala's grandmother, which is why she never made it out of the city of Karachi when the partition was happening, which is the big like cultural migration that happened at that time in real history. Um, in the comics, Kamala was inhuman, so that doesn't seem to be the case here. But I do think that Kamala is not only Jinn, which they come from the Noor dimension with the light-based powers, and Kamran also gets powers in the show. Kamran's powers are similar to Kamala's, so they look the same, and it's because they're Jinn. But Kamala is also different in that she has a mutation, and because of that, she's Marvel's first confirmed mutant in the show. So her powers, or she might have even more powers than her Jinn counterparts do, um, or just greater power. I'm not sure yet, and I don't think the creators know yet either. Um, but yeah, that was really cool to see, and that's pretty much all I think in terms of like the spoiler stuff of stuff that I mentioned earlier. I kind of hit everything on the head. Um, so now I'm just gonna briefly talk about like one or two theories that I have of the show. There's not many. Um, but one is that I feel like at least one of the damage control agents in the show might be a Skrull. I don't know if it's Agent Weaver, or I don't know if that's her name, but the main adversary that was an antagonist in the show. She becomes the antagonist of that finale episode, um, more so than she was earlier in the season, whereas the Clandestine were like the main adversaries before, because they're kind of all stopped in episode 5 when they try to do, or when they actually kind of achieve their goal in the show, which was to open a gateway to their home dimension, the North. But when they try to go through, it actually kills them. And because when that happened, I thought they were Inhumans, because it looked like the Inhuman process of Terrigenesis, where there's like a cocoon that goes over them, and it happens to people whether they're Inhuman or not. But they come out of it if they are Inhuman and with powers, and that's kind of when the Inhumans' powers develop. But if they're not, then they kind of like just die. So these people died, so I thought they were maybe not Inhuman, but they are Jinn, and I thought maybe Kamala would have the power to go through as an Inhuman, but I don't think that's what they were doing. I don't think they're Inhuman at all, or that she's Inhuman at all. I think they're just all Jinn, and then Kamala's different as a mutant, not an Inhuman. But what I think happened, another theory that I have, is that Najma, Kamran's mom, put the veil, which is what the like barrier is called, between dimensions, the Earth dimension and the Noor dimension. Is I think she put the actual veil itself inside Kamran, because she chanted his name as a way to like, close the gate, because it was just gonna destroy everything. And she realized once her fellow people were all killed by it, that it was not gonna work. Um, and I think she did that so that he has the opportunity to possibly see his homeland one day, and go to the Noor dimension. And the reason why I think that, I didn't think about it until the second time I watched it, is because in the finale episode, when he gets his powers, it's because of what she did. It kind of like goes into him like almost like a possession. And he said that he felt like he was being crushed from the inside out. So I feel like that's kind of like the Noor dimension wanting to like open up outside of him, and that's kind of where his powers come from. But he doesn't know how to control it. But his powers seem a lot like more kind of extreme compared to Kamala's. So that's why I think he kind of holds the entire Noor dimension within his own body. So I think he's gonna train and how to use his powers, just like how Kamala did in episode 4, with the Red Dagger, who was the other characters that we met in the show, specifically with I think he's just called the Red Dagger in the comics, one person. Um, so that's pretty much all I have in terms of theories and spoilers. But yeah, I really like this show. I thought it was really good, and I can't wait to see Kamala in the Marvels, which we did get a post-credit scene showing. I think it actually might be in that movie because I heard that it was filmed by the director of the movie, Nia DaCosta. Um, we see Kamala like switch places with Captain Marvel. So wherever Captain Marvel was in the universe, Kamala switched places with her, and it was through the bangle that she wore, which was kind of the family heirloom from her great grandmother, Aisha. And I think it might be related with um, a wrist device that Carol Danvers was wearing as well. And I think it might be rooted in Kree technology because when we first see the bangle, it was on a blue arm in a flashback that showed Aisha for the first time, and the blue skin is a trait of the Kree race, and the Kree are tied with Captain Marvel, um, and they're actually tied within humans as well. So I don't know, we might still see Inhumans be part of Kamala's journey in the MCU. But if not, I don't know. We'll see what happens. But I think there's still a Kree Skrull war going on in the MCU and in space and elsewhere, and that's going to be something that is also played up in the Secret Invasion show on Disney Plus, which is the next show after She-Hulk, I think. The first one coming out next year, so I'm excited for that as well, and just to find out everything that's going on and how it connects. So that's all I'm going to say. I'm going to leave my review there. Thank you for watching, and I'll catch you next time. Peace.